Hey, Rose.
Hi, Christy.
So good to be with you.
Yes, likewise. This is a pleasure to be on the podcast. Thank you for having me on it and hosting me.
I love having you in our community, and I'm just curious about your backdrop. You look like you're being a global nomad today. Do you want to say anything
I
about where you're calling from?
am indeed. I live in Istanbul, Turkey. I'm from the United States, but I needed to get away from Turkey for a bit. I needed a mountain retreat. So I'm on a solo creative working retreat, and I'm in a very remote rural village in southern Bulgaria on the Greek border in the Rhodope Mountains. And it's very magical here. So I'm staying in a guest house that has been has like is an old house, and it's been designed to kind of look traditional, like a traditional Pomak Bulgarian home.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. That's
Yeah.
just like you. Of course, you're traveling in Bulgaria today.
Yeah.
Just happened to be in Bulgaria for the
I'm here for a few
podcast.
weeks in this specific place because I'm like on this creative working retreat. So I needed
Mm,
to be in nature to find to rejuvenate my inspiration, my creativity for various projects I'm working on and for my own well-being.
yeah, sounds wonderful. And if I get you right, you do a lot of writing about women and religion and the Muslim faith. Do you want to say anything about what you're working on now?
Yeah, sure. So I'm by training, I'm an academic. I was formerly a professor of religious studies, Islamic studies, and my first book is coming out soon. It's an academic book about Muslim American prayer practices. That's coming out in like 2 weeks. And so now that it's coming out, it's out of my hands. I can work on my current passion project, which is not academic. Incidentally, since I've been here 2 weeks ago, I finally have a better idea of what the book is because I didn't know. I came here not knowing, needing to figure out what the book is. I had a lot of ideas, but never had this space to figure it out. I find my inspiration in nature, by bodies of water, with the sound of water. So it turns out it's going to be a memoir, somewhat of a memoir, that basically is offering Muslims and anyone interested in Islam a way to look at Islam from a compassion based perspective. Unfortunately, a lot of Muslims nowadays are following Islam in a way that is often based in fear and fear mongering. And I've been there and it didn't work for me. So I decided to switch to a compassion based focus and approach to Islam. And it was not an easy journey. But I now coach people, especially Muslim women, on this issue and help them get to that place. And people kept on asking me, like, we need a book. Like, what can we read about this? Like, how do I know how to do this? I just need something to accompany me to read. And I was like, there's not much to refer you to. There's beautiful text from mystical perspectives, but there's nothing like of talking of contemporary Muslims talking about how they take this approach. So I felt called to write it. I don't know if you've read Liz Gilbert's Big Magic, but she talks about how books are kind of like sent to you. And it was sent to me like a year or two ago. I was like, I let it sink in, but now I finally get a chance to get to know it. I'm like exploring it, asking it what it wants from me. So basically, be anecdotal with some citations from primary sources of Islam to basically talk about what happened to me and then how I'm like re-looking and rethinking through everything from this lens of compassion and love instead of fear. So I don't know all the details, but it's slowly emerging, and I'm excited because I think a lot of people will benefit from reading this sort of thing and not feel like they're terrible people because they think differently than what they're told by mainstream Muslim scholars and leaders.
Yeah. It sounds like it's the book you would have wanted someone to have written for
Oh
you a
my
few
God,
years
yeah,
ago.
totally. Totally. There's not a lot of books I've read that are like this. Are there any? Like a little bit, but exactly. So this is how I live my life is I often feel like a bit of a pioneer and I didn't feel safe in many spaces. I didn't have safe spaces, so what do? I've created safe spaces for people. I've not been offered those spaces myself, so I was like, the only way I can experience them is if I actually make them happen. This has been the story of my life, is creating things that don't exist because I need them, and then turns out a lot of other people need them. And this is what often motivates me in my life, is creating that. It would be nice for someone else to hold space and I can explore it, and I occasionally have experienced that, but yeah, I create spaces for people
Yeah.
to be themselves.
I love that, and it's so important. And I'm coming from a Christian background, and I'm just thinking of all the women who have been instrumental in opening my eyes toward like a
Mm.
really complete shift from
Yeah.
a god that I call Judgy McJudge Face, the
Judgy
the
McJudge
dude in the
face. I
sky
know.
who's really quite compelled to know everything about your sex life and all your sins and evil, and trying to make sure you're being a good girl and all that, to a much more contemplative, open, compassionate, grace-filled spirituality. And the story I'm making up is that there's not maybe women. You talk about not anybody, but I wonder even if women is more lacking in the realm that you're working in.
There's a lot of people working privately and talking
Mhm.
privately, but to speak publicly is much harder because you face backlash, you face talking about taboos is really hard. Just not even about other people, just to say stuff out loud that we only think, that we don't talk about. It takes a lot of work to get over that hump and talk about it. So I don't want to discount the many women doing the work, but primarily in private. There's a handful of women doing it publicly, but most feel unable to because it feels so much safer to do it privately. Yeah, so I'm trying to do it a bit more publicly, and I'm still working on the process myself. Like I start and stop this all the time. Like I'll start taking some emotional risk and sharing things, and then something will trigger me, and I stop for a long while, and then I start again, and then I start, and I stop, and it's a cycle that
Hmm.
hopefully will become easier the more practice I have getting back into it.
What does give you the courage to keep on speaking openly about moving from fear to compassion?
Yeah, well, I know that when I share, first of all, it feels like a release. It's like no longer belongs to me. The stories that people have told me, when I share them publicly, it's like, here you go, world. Here you go, God. This is my complaint. This is my love for you, and here it is. So it's helpful to release it instead of bottling it up, first of all. It's it's really beautiful when I hear from people, not just women too, about how much it resonates with them, that what I'm sharing, knowing that they needed to hear that too because they've had the similar thoughts. They just didn't know how to express it. They haven't seen someone express it in the way I have. So it's very helpful for them. When I work with clients and they just are able to live their lives more lightly because of the work we do together, to know that they're not hated by God, they're not impure people because of a few mistakes they made. That judgy judge face, I love that name, is not our God, But a lot of
Yeah.
Muslims would like to prop up judge face. I'm like, that's not my God. That's not the Islam I believe in. I choose to believe that God is deeply compassionate and merciful and only wants the best for people, and that our goal is to try to do our best, but we make mistakes along the way and we ask God for forgiveness, and then we keep on going, and that's the state of humans.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of a book I read, from my faith tradition called A Generous Orthodoxy. And
Mm.
I'd love to hear, like, as you move into this more, as the imagination of God moves from fear based to compassion based, to what extent do you consider orthodoxy of the faith or not?
Yeah, I don't know that book, but I'll have to check it out. Generous Orthodoxy sounds beautiful, like a beautiful title. One of the books that inspired me was actually Glennon Doyle's Untamed. And she was an
Yeah.
evangelical Christian who then became obviously a lesbian, and I don't know how aligned she is with Christianity anymore, but it was a deeply spiritual book. But I just love the way she wrote and was very open and vulnerable and took huge emotional risks going from that evangelical community. So in terms of orthodoxy for me, I've never been a very orthodox person. And what's interesting is that orthodox means correct belief. Whereas what's interesting is that Islam is actually an orthoprax religion, which Islam focuses a lot on practice as much as belief. Because, for example, the 5 pillars of Islam are, first of all, it's correct belief. I guess you can say action is the testimony that there is no God but God and Muhammad is the prophet. Then you have the practices of praying 5 times a day. You have the practice of fasting in Ramadan. You have the practice of giving 2.5% of your gross annual income of charity. And then you have the practice of Hajj. Those are like the correct practices, and there's many other practices that Muslims integrate. So Christianity is based on doctrine, and Islam is too, but it's also based on practice. It's very important that it's also orthoprax. In my healing path, when I was actually very close to leaving Islam because it felt too hurtful, I had to experiment with prayer, for example. So a lot of Muslims see prayer as in a fear-based, consequential kind of way, that if you don't pray, the hellfire is waiting for you. Okay. And I felt scared when I didn't pray, like actually scared. I was like, what will happen to me if I don't pray? So I had to intentionally make a huge shift with prayer, for example, because it's a really important practice. I was working with a somatic therapist at the time. She was Jewish, and she actually helped me reapproach prayer in a way. It was useful that she wasn't Muslim because I don't think I would be able to work with a Muslim therapist who's open enough on this topic. So I had to experiment not praying and not praying all the prayers, not praying at all. And with her, what I realized is that prayer in Islam is an incredibly beautiful practice. It's very akin to yoga, for example, 5 times a day, throughout the day, segmented during times when we need breaks. Essentially, we participate in a practice that takes 5-10 minutes at the most, not even, where we make the intention, we purify ourselves with water. So that's just always, water is a beautiful practice to purify ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally. We then recite prayers in Arabic, which, as you know, in somatic practices, recitation is like causes like vibrations and it's very healing. And then we engaged in what some looks like to some people a yoga practice, going up and down, up and down. It's a very physical movement, combining that nowadays I do with breath, for example. So we have sound, movement, breath, presence, right? So I realized that prayer isn't this like duty you have to do and God will punish you if you don't. But I started to realize, especially with the help of my somatic therapist, who recommended I pray. Like if a Muslim tells me to pray, I don't want to, but she was like, just try it out. Try reading the Quran, seeing how it feels. I was like, it actually feels really good. And it felt so different from her than a Muslim man with a beard and a turban, you know? So what I did is start to experience the feeling of presence and prayer, and sometimes even doing some of the movements or sounds, not in a prayer practice, but just to feel the different positions and the presence. And I started to realize it's such a gift that we have. So Islam has all these ancient practices that Muslims have been carrying out for more than 1400 years. And it turns out that they're actually really amazing practices to help humans regulate their nervous system, to calm down, to regain their energy in very specific times of the day. One is pre-dawn. That's the hardest one for me. I'm not a morning person, so pre-dawn. The next one is in the middle of the day, like 12 or 1 o'clock, right? Like right when it's like lunchtime. I think about people mainly agricultural in the olden days, right? So you need that break. The next one is mid-afternoon, like 3, 4, 5 o'clock, depending on the time of the year. And then you have sunset, and then you have an hour after sunset. When you're getting ready for bed in those days when you didn't have electricity, you go to sleep an hour after sunset or so. So it's amazing that it breaks up the day. You have this time to sometimes gather with other Muslims, sometimes pray at home or elsewhere. And it's incredibly beautiful a combination of somatic work, breath work, and other ritual practices. And so I started to actually love prayer in ways that I used to when I was younger, and then I lost it somehow. And a lot of Muslims have this experience of losing the connection to prayer and the anxiety of other Muslims about needing to pray on time and the consequences if you don't. So I've even led some Muslims in workshops on coming back to prayer and experiencing just the feeling of different movements and practices. And so it's been quite the journey. And this is just one example of like what orthodoxy, like how I kind of think about it. I don't usually work well with just following mainstream doctrine, especially because as a scholar of Islam, I've studied Islamic history and theology and doctrine, and I'm very aware that there have been many ways to be Muslim over time in many different countries. You know, I've been able to travel to Muslim majority countries such as Bulgaria. I actually ended up in a village that's Muslim, and the whole region I'm in is Muslim, and they're very chill Muslims who live through communism. So their Islam is very stripped down to cultural practices. Interestingly enough, with some revival from kind of modern day kind of preachers, I think. So it's interesting to be in a country that has like very chill Muslims. Then you go to Saudi Arabia where they're like very like fiery, like puritanical. Then you go to like West Africa where they're very relaxed, mystical Muslims. So because of my lived experience traveling and meeting people and then studying, I know that there's not one way to be Muslim, but most Muslims think and believe that there is just Islam and Islam is the way they understand it. But when I talk about Islam, I talk about Islams, and knowing that there's so many ways to be Muslim, and I choose a way that is resonant with me, because why else would I be Muslim to follow a religion that is just not congruent with myself?
Hmm. So back to your practices, it sounds like there was a real shift, or like you had it when you were a kid and then somehow it disappeared into like, maybe you didn't use these words, but maybe duty and rewards and punishments, and that didn't feel good. And so now you want your practices to be about, this is actually good for me, and it's good for my body and soul. It's refreshing. I enjoy it. It's pleasurable. Would you say that's the main difference and the main
Yeah.
thing maybe you work with others?
Well, interesting enough, I didn't grow up Muslim, so I didn't grow up praying Muslim in Islamic ways, but I became Muslim at 19, and at that time, early on, I met my ex-husband, who was a very conservative, traditional Muslim from Arab country, and so he raised me as a Muslim, and so I think what happens, I absorbed his anxiety and fear and beliefs about prayer, which was very much consequentially based. He would be in a bad mood the whole day if he didn't pray the morning prayer, for example, and nothing could change that except the next day if he prayed on time. So, but before I had met him, I had beautiful experiences with prayer. It was just like me alone. I wanted to be some kind of mystic, mystical Sufi woman, and then I met him, and it changed over the years. So part of my healing path has been deprogramming myself from what I took away from learning how to be Muslim in that marriage, essentially. So yes, you could say going from that fear-based approach to realizing that, to appreciating the wisdom of the rituals we've been given within Islam. Like I have become certified in breathwork, for example. But now I've been doing research into Sufi texts on breathwork in the pre-modern era. It turns out breathwork is not a new trendy thing. It's just that people nowadays are making it a new trendy, well-being practice. Turns out people have been doing this for centuries and thousands of years. So it's just really cool to find out that my tradition contains wisdom that's currently trendy that I can go back to and say, hey, well, Muslims no longer practice Sufi breathwork, most Muslims, for example. So I'm trying to like bring it back to people and show them like you can actually, this is part of our tradition. There's been people integrating this into their lives for a long time. So I think a lot of Muslims, including myself, we absorb what other people tell us about it, and learning that the practices are deeply compassionate and helpful instead of being oppressive. And a lot of people feel it's oppressive. And then when I work with clients, they feel it's oppressive and it's like they're going to be punished, but they also have a deep love for it. So I often help people, they're like, I want to pray, but I can't. And that can take many months. It's taken up to a year to help someone even start to pray once a day, for example, because they have a lot of trauma connected to it. So people who are born and raised Muslim, if they're from a conservative family, like some clients we've discovered that when they think of God, one woman, like she thinks of her grandfather who was not kind person, or another person, they just associate prayer with the unkindness of their family, shaming them about prayer and why they should do it and what happens if they don't. So there's a lot to unpack from their past in order to reapproach prayer in a new way. And it's one of the things I do support people with. Yeah.
Hmm. How would you say your own imagination of God has evolved?
That's a great question. How's my own imagination of God? When I was a little girl, since I was 11 years old, I like to say I've been on a spiritual journey. I was a very precocious young girl, and I would meet religious leaders or anyone. I was like, "What's the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life?" I would ask really big questions. I just needed to understand, like, why was I there? What was I supposed to do? I remember meeting the Dalai Lama when I was 11, and I was just infatuated with the Dalai Lama, like obsessed with him. I had posters all around my walls in my bedroom. No boys to men. It was Dalai Lama. And I would read his books and probably not understand a lot, but I was trying to understand, even though it was way above my head because I was a little girl. But I understood enough, and I don't know what God was then. Like I was trying to figure it out. I was very curious. When I went through my Buddhist phase for a number of years, I really enjoyed it, but I eventually left because it didn't have a strong enough concept of God. And that's what ended up being the reason why I left. I loved the practices, but I felt it was missing. I didn't want to pray to a statue, and I wanted a concept of God. So when I entered into Islam through Sufism specifically, I was reading the Sufi text, Rumi, and all the different poets and the Sufi mystics and their discussion of God. It just lit a fire within me. I was like, this is what I want. It wasn't Orthodox Islam. It was kind of the mystical idea of God in Sufism, really, which is a very important part of Islam, but not so orthodox for many people. And it was like the idea that, for example, Ibn al-Arabi is a very well-known Sufi mystic from Andalusia, and he talked about God as being everywhere, everything is a manifestation of the divine. Everything in this world reflects the divine. And this is actually a little bit heretical for mainstream Muslims. For he was banned in many countries. I think you can't buy his books in all countries until today, just because he lived in this very different way of seeing the divine and his connection to the divine in ways that it didn't work for mainstream Muslims. He wanted to approach and connect with God in an intimate level. He was like the idea that you lose your ego and you become in union with God. And this is like what I so craved, what I so desired. And so I've been on that journey of understanding God in that way. And for some years I maintained that. And I think during my marriage it might have dimmed a little, because God became a little more punitive for me and my perception of God. But now I've been back to, as I've experienced my inner and outer liberation, I've been going back to I'm looking here because I'm just looking at a mountain full of trees and it's just so beautiful. And I think of God, I just want to look at the mountain. Like I'm working during the daytime, I go for a hike in the mountains by the river, and I just feel the presence of the divine with me, and it feels true to me and it feels right. So for me, I don't have a traditional idea of God for Muslims, but a lot of Muslims would agree and would align with how I see God too. But there's different ways of how Muslims see God, just like different ways of how Christians see God. Mine is very expansive and based on the idea of compassion. When Muslims start anything, they say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. The most merciful, the most compassionate, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, are the two most recited names of God or spoken names of God by Muslims, because this prayer is something that Muslims say countless times every day. I couldn't count how many times I say that. So it's a very important names of God. God has 99 names in Islam, but these are the most important ones, not the judge, not the bestower, but the compassionate, the most merciful. So I take that in order to remind myself and others that it's the mercy and compassion that God wants us to remember about God's self.
Hmm. Yeah. And there's I don't know if you use these words, transcendent and immanent. I mean, there's sort of a God is far away, up in the sky, kind of personal, almost has a body kind of thing, and is somewhere in a place almost in the imagination. Um, and then there's this God is within, in the cells of my body,
Mhm.
creating me every moment, creating the
Yeah.
grass, creating the trees, like part of everything living and otherwise. And I'm just wondering, do you still feel like you have both those wrapped up somewhere, or is it
I
more
mean,
one than the other?
I think that's a Christian idea to see God in the skies, in the sky.
Okay.
I don't think Muslims believe God is like up in the sky. There's a quote in the Quran that Muslims love. It says, God says, I am closer to you than your jugular vein, right? Which is like the vein running here.
Uh-huh.
So, like, God, that's very close. So, the idea, like, Muslims, we love sitting with that verse and just like reflecting on, like, how close is the jugular vein? It's here, it's our lifeline. If you cut it, we're dead, right? So, the idea that God is closer, this is not just a Sufi idea that God is not just in the sky. God is closer to us than our jugular veins. So God is within us. God is everywhere. We are not God, but we are part of God. We are emanating from God. Um, yeah, so that's how I see it. I don't see God as something apart from me, far away, that I have to like look to the skies. I look to the skies because it's beautiful, not because God is there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, where do you think this whole punitive idea, I mean, is that just coming from people's inner critic, or coming from the patriarchy, or coming from an
Yeah.
imagination of God as a person who judges, or
I have lots of
why
ideas
why
about
is
that.
it still so unorthodox to think of God as like right here and merciful if that's part of the original
It's not
language?
unorthodox because, like I said, that's in the Quran, that verse about the jugular vein.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts about that topic. Thank you for asking. I think that hurt people hurt people. That's one thing I've learned, and that people carry a
Mm.
lot of trauma and hurt. And if they're told stories when they're young and they're not treated well and they're hurt, that they're going to carry this on. I think for centuries in many different traditions, they carry this on in through a patriarchal tradition. I don't think Islam itself is inherently patriarchal, but unfortunately the way it's been presented is. And the way it's been lived by many Muslims is because it's been men. If you think about the legal scholar, all the scholarship on Islam, it's been primarily male, elite male scholarship of men figuring out how Muslims should adhere to the rules of the Quran, right? And there's almost no women until recently of women interpreting and applying the Quran. I think that trauma plays a part in that people are not aware of their own trauma that they hold. And I'm thinking about, for example, when I go to a mosque and I hear an imam say some really stupid things, okay? Like I remember hearing, yeah, like a number of years ago in California, going to a sermon on Friday or maybe it was Eid prayer, and he was anti-Semitic, for example. Or making a comment that women belong at home and that their role is to raise the children and take care of the home and they shouldn't be in society so much. They need to go back to traditional roles. I'm talking about United States in the 21st century. I'm not talking about 10th century Saudi Arabia. Yeah, I'm talking about America, California, which is where I used to live. So it was unacceptable to me. But these imams, for example, they were imported from other countries where they have very traditional training. They have no idea what American Muslim lives are like. They have no idea what it's like to be a young person navigating American society, trying to hold on to being Muslim while also having millions of temptations and other ways of living all around you. They have no idea. They just know that the way they've been raised, and so they carry that on and they teach Sunday school and they continue that pattern, and it doesn't stop until, for example, their children don't turn out like they do. One of their child might turn out gay or something like different, a drug addict. That's when they have to confront that their little la la land they live in isn't so perfect, and that they need to figure out and find that compassion within themselves, uh, so that they can hopefully support if their child, for example. So the patriarchy definitely has harmed thousands of generations of people and held women back. Yeah, it's such a big topic. I don't even know. Like my brain is going in so many
It
directions and
is.
like shooting
It
off. I'm
is
like,
a big topic.
where do I go from
Well, and you
there?
mentioned hell too a bit earlier,
Yeah,
and I wasn't even aware that there was necessarily that concept in Islam. But like, what would an Islamic imagination of hell be about?
very similar to Christian ideas of hell. Really, actually, Islam does share a lot of uh, theological beliefs with Christianity as well as Judaism, although Judaism doesn't have the same concept of hell. But the hellfire is definitely similar in Islam, and the Quran talks about hellfire in very graphic ways. It talks about our limbs, our hands, our mouth. Different parts of us are going to witness us on the day of judgment. So they're going to speak our sins and speak what we've done. It talks about the way that we'll be burned forever, from sins. But here's the thing, a lot of Muslims get super scared about that. But I don't think those messages of hell are for them. That's what I've determined. For example, right now we're witnessing one of the worst genocides in history with the Israeli military killing innocent Gazans every single day. And I'm just infuriated. And American government, my government, is supporting this genocide, right? When I think about the people in the Israeli military and government who are making the decision to not stop, because we know that it can stop in an instant, they can just stop killing people if they wanted to. And the American government who's sending military aid on a regular basis. I think of the sins that they carry and how sinful they are for the crimes they're committing against humanity. And one day they will face retribution in The Hague, perhaps, as well as another time after. But I think that the chronic message about hellfire is meant to be sending very strong messages to people who are actually carrying out very sinful actions. Like, that is no question how sinful those actions are. Whereas when I work with Muslims who feel sinful, maybe they hugged a man, maybe they slept with someone like maybe they made a normal human mistake that didn't actually hurt anyone. That just is them slipping up, experimenting because they're human, right? I don't I'd like to believe, I can't say this is Islamic, but I'd like to believe that the message of hellfire is not for those people. Because the Quran also talks about compassion and mercy and forgiveness. And in Islam, we don't have the idea of the original sin, which is great. It makes it a lot easier. In Islam, we make mistakes, we sin, and then we ask God to forgive us. So we have a process of repentance. You just ask God, and then hopefully you're forgiven. And that's it. It's a very simple thing. And you can do it a million times in your life. As long as you do it, before you die, we repent and we hope we're good with God. So I really do believe that certain people do need to hear those punitive messages because they're evil. And I used to ignore those verses of the hellfire, but when the Gaza genocide started, and then people I know started to share those verses, I was really disturbed. But then I was like, they said it was actually comforting for them to read those verses, because if the people involved in murdering all these innocent civilians aren't getting retribution in our modern world, then it was comforting to know that at least they'll get retribution when they die. So that's a way I've been thinking, actually, not for not that long, but it's like a way I make sense of things. And we all have to tell ourselves
Hmm.
stories and make sense of things. So that makes sense to me, that the wrong people are taking those verses to heart, and it ruins them. It makes everything so hard. And the right people who should be listening obviously don't care. Um, but I really do hope and believe that they will face severe punishment for their horrendous crimes. Yeah.
Yeah, which is so fascinating to me because your main message to women is so full of compassion, and there's this dialectic or the polarity, like a Buddhist cone or something, where you both want love, compassion, mercy, and justice and
Mhm.
punishment and righteousness and those
Mhm.
things at the same time, but in their proper way, if I'm getting you right.
Islam is not a passive religion or pacifist religion. For example,
Mm.
one of the biggest controversial terms, jihad, people think it means a religious war on non-Muslims. That's not what it is. Jihad means you're able to fight when your lives, when your homeland is being threatened. For example, Palestinians, you could say, are engaging in legitimate jihad, even though it's very controversial, because they're going to be obliterated if they didn't fight, for example. Jihad is very controversial. We're not going to go down that path because of how it's been understood in
We could
America.
talk about the
Yeah,
Crusades and all. Yeah,
yeah,
there's plenty we could say.
exactly.
Sure.
It's not a holy war. It's an
Mm.
active defense to protect yourselves. So in Islam, you're supposed to stand up for justice, for what is right. The biggest reward or the biggest good deed you can do is speak the truth in front of an unjust ruler, for example. So it's one thing I like and I love about Islam. Actually, what brings a lot of people into Islam is the social justice aspect. For example, a lot of African Americans and other minorities in the United States become Muslim through Malcolm X, inspired by his work, right? Who's social justice oriented. And
Mm-hmm.
because it's like standing up for what is right and speaking against the oppressor is so powerful. So I think it's a very interesting part of Islam that Americans and others aren't so aware of because of all the stereotypes and then the post 9/11 confusion, and they miss the really beautiful thing about
Americans have 330 million guns in circulation, and we're the first ones to pick up, take justice into our own hands in
Yep.
real life and in the movies and everything
Yeah.
else. So I don't think we have much of a
Yeah.
leg to stand on if we want to
Yeah.
judge people.
Exactly. Like if someone asked me like what would an Islamic society look like, Saudi
Mm.
Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, nothing like it. I really do imagine a country like somewhere in Scandinavia, but just Muslim, you know, but very egalitarian. There's very little poverty. Like in a Muslim society should have no poverty because the idea of Muslims are supposed to give enough charity that there are no people going hungry. You need to make sure all your neighbors have food, for example. Um, you need to make sure everyone feels safe and secure, that everyone's social welfare is being taken care of. So a Muslim society that actually is Muslim and Islamic would be incredibly beautiful. I've never seen it happen. It would be
Well,
amazing.
it's funny. The last question we like to ask people on the podcast is if you could create whatever kind of world, like what are you about? What kind of world do you want to create and co create as a coach and with your clients and as a human being? And it sounds to me like you're already starting to describe the kind of world you would want to create. I don't know. What do you
I mean,
say?
I'm someone who grew up in the United States. I now live in Turkey, a Muslim majority country. So it's not about who's in power. I don't need to create an Islamic state or anything, but it's about creating at the grassroots level because I don't have the ability to create beyond that. But at the grassroots level, like the way I'm raising my son to be a very compassionate, empathetic young man. He's 10 years old now, who deeply cares about other humans, who wants to help other humans, who's a critical. So what I want is a world where people are kind to themselves and compassionate to themselves, because when you are kind to yourself, then it's much easier to be kind to yourself, to others. And the idea in Islam is that we have these 99 names of God, and that humans need to work to manifesting the names in their lives. So one of the names that I focus the most, obviously, is the compassionate one, the merciful one. So for me, this beautiful world would be trying to figure out as often as possible is how am I manifesting compassion in my life so that others experience that from me and they also practice it too. And I just think that if people started with that, I can't imagine how beautiful the world would be. We never give ourselves or others enough compassion, benefit of the doubt, space for slipping up, being human, making mistakes, but there's always the possibility of returning. I think it'd be a beautiful way to raise children. I'm engaged in that experiment now, what it's like to raise a child in that way, what it's like to live in a society. I would love to live in a society like that, in a community like that. We'll see. Yeah, what a beautiful question.
Oh, I wish we could have gone down every single one of the rabbit trails and just you can come to my house and we'll just sit on the couch and talk for 6 days,
Yeah.
and just barely get started. You're such a beautiful person, and
Uh,
I want to appreciate you for your courage in writing your memoir and your dedication taking this whole these weeks away, and for your book about Muslim prayer in American society and your work with bringing a compassionate view to Muslim women and a new way to practice that you're pioneering. Um, any final words that you would like to say? Anything we skipped most things. We could really keep going, but anything that's been kind of in your mind or heart that you think would be really important to say to close?
Well, first, I just want to thank you, Christy, because you hold space so well. And the way you ask questions and listen deeply, and it's reflected in this conversation. I feel safe to speak about it with you without judgment. And that is not always common, especially with non-Muslims, because of all the stereotypes and all the difficulty Muslims face with Islamophobia. So it's been a beautiful conversation, and that we haven't needed to go in that usual direction I usually go in when I talk about Islam with non-Muslims. We went in such a more you approached me as if I'm from any other religion, and it was so humanizing in a way. And I don't know if I've had an interview about Islam in that way. So first, I just want to commend you and show my gratitude towards you for just approaching me as a Muslim in a religion called Islam that's not just that religion that people think about, going beyond that.
Oh, now you're
Um,
making me tear up.
and it's so
I mean,
sad that this is how the state
oh,
of things. So,
well, that's the world I want to co-create too,
yeah,
is one where everyone gets to show up and we get to connect at the level
yeah,
of being human together.
yeah.
There's so many beautiful practices and so many religions, and I took heart from you learning from a Jewish person. So many of my Jewish friends are not wanting to send their sons off to war, and
Hmm.
not, there's just, the powers that be do need to be dismantled when they're
Yeah,
creating violence and trampling on the real humans who want love and connection and
yeah,
justice and peace and all the good things. And so it's an honor for me to get to spend time with you and be people together right here,
yeah,
right now.
yeah. To be humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rose.
Yeah,
I'm going to read everything you write. I love how you talk. I love what you're doing with women. And thank you so much for being here.
yeah. Many blessings. Thank you so much, Christy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Hmm.